Welcome everybody to the Health Babes podcast. This is Dr. Becky Campbell with my co-host, Dr. Krystal Hone. And we have Brian on today. He is amazing. He is really, there is a lot of different mold, specialists out there. And me being someone who suffered with illness from mold, I'm very picky about who I trust in this area. So Brian Karr is who I trust. So we wanted to have him on, and I know that a lot of you want to know, and a lot of you are living in mold and you don't know what to do about it. You don't know how to find it. And then you don't know what to do once you do find it, if you can find it. So welcome, Brian Karr.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm super excited.
Yes, us too. This is a hot topic, and it's still not well versed, right? So we're excited for you to answer all our questions.
Yay, that's why I'm here.
And we have a lot.
I'm excited.
All right, so let's start out. Let's talk about mold. Like, what is toxic mold?
So it's funny because I think people think toxic mold is like this special thing. When they say toxic mold, what they're actually really talking about is what's called a mycotoxin, which is a chemical that molds create, and that's the toxin. So if you think of it, like if mold is a factory, right? The mold is the factory, the toxin is the thing the factory creates. So that's kind of the difference. And a lot of times we lump them together and we say, oh, it's toxic mold. I think most people are actually talking about the toxins. Basically what happens is certain molds have the ability to produce this chemical toxin and certain molds don't. And so there's kind of two ways to think. Like when we say toxic mold, do we mean, oh, this particular mold that has the ability to do that? I don't think that a lot of us are like well-versed enough to really like be meaning that, you know what I mean? So I think a lot of people are just thinking of the toxins, but the one thing about it is that there's a lot of molds that can create these mycotoxins, and not just one. So the other thing that a lot of people think sometimes when they say toxic mold is they are specifically referring to a mold that's called Stachybotrys, which is what's known as the black toxic mold. And it just, like I said, there's multiple molds that can create the toxins. It's just, I use this like joke all the time that Stacky just has a really good PR agent and they just got really well known.
Love that.
But there's other ones too. So when we use that phrase, I just like very like drawn out explanation, but it's just to understand like what we're actually talking about. So you have a mold type that is the living organism. You have a chemical byproduct that certain molds can create that are a toxin that's meant to kill living things. That's what it's meant to do. So those are the two components of it. Multiple molds can produce different types of toxins, and that's kind of how it all works together.
So why doesn't everybody get sick from mold exposure?
You know what? I think more people actually are than no. First off, but there are things, and you guys will probably even speak more to it than I can, right? But there's genetic predisposition. So just specifically from one gene expression, 25% of the population is more susceptible. Then you have previous exposures. So if you were exposed in your young years when your immune system is developing, it can literally rewrite how your body reacts to environmental triggers, like moving forward for the rest of your life. So people who grew up in like a wet basement or this or that, and you hear all these things. And I was talking to Dr. Tanya Dempsey a while ago, and we were talking about the immune system piece. I always thought that when you're like 10 years old or younger, that's kind of what I thought, like your young age when your immune system is being developed. She told me that your immune system isn't completely developed till sometimes you're almost 20. Mm-hmm. So think about when you go to college, right? And all these like crappy dorms that are in colleges, you're 18, you're 19, you're 20, like that could be the tail end of your immune system development, which I thought was super interesting. And so those previous exposures can basically change how your body reacts to that stuff moving forward. And then the third thing is just kind of what your current health position is, right? So like your immune system can only handle so much. If you have Lyme disease and you have other things going on, it makes you more susceptible to mold exposure. So there's so many different elements. Women are more susceptible than men. I mean, there's just so many things that go on. So that's why people react differently. But I did a presentation last year, an industry presentation for actual like inspectors and remediators. And it was called mold remediation for hypersensitive people. That was like what it was all about. And I was trying to figure out how to illustrate like how many people are actually susceptible to this stuff. Because a lot of people in our industry, they think they work with one client that's hypersensitive, and they think that they're just this annoying client. Most people aren't like that. And I wish I didn't have to work with this person. I wish I could just work with people that would let me come take air samples and not know what I'm doing and make my life easy, right? Like that's what they wish. And I was like, it's more than that. And so I just went, and there's even more than what I pulled. But I pulled number of people with SIRS, which is just 25% of population off that genetic issue.
Do you want to say real quick, Brian, what SIRS is?
Yeah, it's chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So when I talked about that genetic expression, that gene expression, it's referring to that. So 25% of the population basically have a genetic issue that doesn't allow them to detox environmental contaminants well, right? So that's 25% of the population. Then I just looked up the number of people that had Lyme disease in like the last 10 years, I think, the number of people that had autoimmune diseases, and the number of PANS and PANDAS diagnoses from the different organizations that kind of track that stuff. It was over 40% of the US population in just those 4 things. Wow. And there's more than that can make you susceptible, right? So like, it was just those 4 things. You're talking 40% of the US, it's like 130 million people or something that fell into that. So I took this picture of Fenway Park and on all the audience in the crowd, and that was the first picture I showed. And then the next slide, I had arrows pointing to 40% of the people. And I was like, all of these people are susceptible to mold. Yeah. And this is why it's important that we're talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, one thing I like to point out to people, and, especially our patients is, and they're like, well, why doesn't my husband feel this way? But I do, and it's really your ability to push the toxins out, so, and really anything, let's say you're exposed to heavy metals. I mean, it really all works the same, but it's like methylation, your body's ability to take stuff in and get it out. And some people are really good at that. And some people are really bad at that, and they hold on to everything. And then that's how they become so sensitive. So that's kind of what he's referring to when he, is talking about SIRS and the different way that different people respond. So how do mycotoxins move throughout a home? Because I think that people think, and I've heard people say this so many times, like, oh, I had mold in my office. They remediated my office. And I'm like, okay, what about the rest of your house? Because it's not, there's no way it's only in that one place. I mean, in my opinion. So you tell us, what do you think? How does that happen?
I love it. I talk about this all the time. So I actually do this like webinar that we're turning into an automated thing so people can access it whenever they want. But this is kind of one of the things I talk about, and it's talking about how I kind of give this setup of, imagine your house is split into 3 levels. Not upstairs, downstairs, basement, but just kind of 3 kind of levels that we're creating. The top level is your heating and air conditioning system. So it's basically the forced air that's getting pushed out of the vents, right? The second level is all the structural components. This is your walls, your ceilings, your floors, your cabinets. This is typically where the mold sources are. They're growing in walls and ceilings and all these places. So basically what's happening from level 1, the heating and air conditioning system is pushing air forcefully into the house. The heating air conditioning system becomes cross-contaminated when you have sources in the house, because what that system is doing, it's sucking air in from the living space, bringing it into the system, and then it heats it or cools it, and then it sends it back out. So if you have mold sources in the living space, it's going to suck all the byproduct in, push it through, and send it out. So in one way, you're getting forced air just pushing it out, right? And there are times when the HVAC systems are super contaminated. There's other times where we think you might be able to clean them. It just kind of depends on what's happening in the house and how long it's been going on, basically. So you have that forced ventilation pushing out. Then you have the structural components, the walls and the ceilings and stuff. And so like a question that comes up all the time, it's like, yeah, but it's behind the wall. So like it's trapped behind the wall, right? And the quick answer to that is, listen, guys, if it was always trapped behind the wall, then nobody would ever be sick from mold, because it would never come out. Like, right? If you just think of it that way. But there's actual building science that talks about how stuff gets pushed out from the walls. So like the quick analogy that people can really usually relate with is like, have you ever opened a door and a door somewhere else in another room just slams shut?
Yes.
So that is invisible airflow in your house. And the airflow is moving so hard that it literally slammed a door shut in your house like a ghost, right? And so anytime that you open a door, open a window, turn on your air conditioning system, turn on the exhaust fan in your bathroom because it's starting to suck air in, turn on the dryer, you're drying your clothes, it's sucking air out and sending it out of the house. All of these things you do change the pressure of the building, and it makes air move through all the building materials. And so I used to do expert witnessing every now and then. I try not to do it because it's not really like what I want to be doing. Like I want to be helping people more directly. But when you go in and do that, you have to have proof for everything you're saying, right?
Yeah.
So like I could talk to you guys and you guys could just believe me, which is awesome. But like when I go to court, like they're literally like, okay, well, prove it to me. And so there's also research papers that show that this happens. Like I come armed like with basically these research studies that show how airflow moves out of walls and different things like that. So
That's great.
so when you're talking about like, how does this stuff move through the house? So what happens, level 1 is pushing out from the ventilation. Level 2 is kind of seeping out from the walls and the ceilings and all those other areas. And they kind of accumulate in this middle breathing zone, right? Then gravity pulls all that down to surfaces. And the surfaces are level 3. Think the top of anything. Like if you ever dusted anything in your life and there was dust there, this is where mold and toxins are accumulating. The dust holds all of it. And then what happens is that, go ahead.
I've heard that the dust feeds mold. Is that the proper way to say that?
It can, right? So there's kind of two ways that it happens. There's the dust can just be an accumulation point, right? And it can just hold it. And so imagine like you had a bunch of stuff floating in the air and it all settled down on surfaces and the dust just collects all of it. So that's one way. The second way is dust is an organic compound. It's an organic food source. So if you did have mold that landed in dirt and dust and then the moisture levels were right, it could actually start growing and feeding on it. So it is a food source, but it's not always, the reason the dust is an issue is not always because it's growing in it. A lot of it is because it's just harboring there. And then as we walk around the house, there's this idea that's called the human cloud effect. It's like, if you guys ever watched Charlie Brown, and remember the kid, the really dirty kid, Pigpen, that had like all the dirt around him everywhere. So that is literally what's happening to us as we walk around everywhere in our house, except it's not visible. It's invisible particles that are floating around that we can't see with our eyes. So if you imagine everything that floated into the air that we were talking about and settled down on surfaces, and then we sit down on our chair or we walk on a carpet or whatever, it all gets popped up and it's constantly this cloud around us of whatever's in our house. That's how we get exposed. It pops into our breathing zone and we breathe it. And that's the exposure to mold, to mycotoxins, even to the bacterial components too.
Talk a little bit about the air sampling and how it can give us a false sense of security. Because we hear this a lot in practice too. Well, I got I got it tested and everything came back negative. And, just talk a little bit about that.
An air sample.
Right.
Yeah. You know what? I'm sure the same with you guys. Every test that you run has strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
But you can't just run like one test and have it tell you everything, right? And it's the same for what we do. There's specific times and places to use certain type of tests. I don't want to bash air sampling because it can be super, super effective if it's done the right way. But when you stick an air sampling pump in the middle of the room, which is what most inspectors do, and you collect an air sample for 5 minutes, it's going to give you a false sense of security more often than not, or a false negative, I should say. So what I did for a year when I was going to inspections, I knew this happened just from seeing it all the time, but I wanted to try to prove it. So every house that I was in, I would pick one spot where I felt pretty confident there was a hidden mold problem, like behind a wall or in a cabinet or something. I would take the source air test from that space. So when we think of air tests, let's separate it. You have ambient air sampling. An ambient air sample is taking an air sample just from the middle of a room, not really next to anything, but just kind of in the middle of the space. The whole idea behind it is that we're getting breathing level air. Like that's what people think that they're getting when they're doing that. It's just so misleading. So that's called ambient air test. Then there's source air testing, which is getting as close to where we think the mold is hiding or growing as we can. That's really where the strength of it is. So for example, if I'm looking at a wall, because most mold is hidden, you don't see it, right? So the big secret, guys, to finding mold is to not actually look for it, is to look for water damage.
Yeah.
And if you understand how to look for water damage, we know that 80% of the time that there is water damage, there's a hidden mold source behind there. And this is from just we pulled like the last 200 samples we did like a month or two ago, and that's what we saw. So if you know how to look for water damage, you can find a lot of this stuff on your own, or you just have to know what that looks like. So anyways, so what we did is like in a wall in a house, let's say, I would do an air test within the wall, which is literally put a little hole in the wall, put a tube through the hole, connect that to our air sampling pump, and then take an air test from behind the wall, basically. So this is where we think the mold is hiding. This is where we take it. Air tests are awesome for that because you can't visibly see it on the front. If you surface sampled a wall on the front and there's no visible growth there, you're going to come up with a negative. But if you can get back behind where it is, and you can get to these like hard to reach places, then air tests are really, really great for that, right? So what I did is I would find a place like that, I would do one. Then I took literally like 2 or 3 steps away. I put an air pump up like 3 feet away from it, right at breathing space, the way everybody does it. And I would collect a sample there too. And I did this for like a year. 70% of the time it was a false negative, meaning I found mold in the wall, but the air sample I took 3 feet away said there was no problem. And this is why you can't use air samples like that. It's because that's their strength. The further you get from the source, they get exponentially less effective. As you get super close, it's awesome, right? But as you get far away, it's not.
So I just want to quickly insert a story here because when I had mold, it was a broken pipe in the cement underneath carpet. So
I'll never forget that with you too.
Yes, it was under my bed, and I can walk into any room if there's mold, I can smell it immediately. I smelled nothing. I did not smell mold, but it was under where I was sleeping. And I literally would wake up the next day feeling like I drank an entire bottle of alcohol. Like that's how horrible I felt because I was just breathing in all night. So they came in and did an air sample, found nothing. Well, then we decided to get a new bed and we moved the bed. Once we picked up the mattress, we were like, oh, like the smell really came out. But what happened was there was a picture, like a big picture being stored under the bed. And so the water was coming in through the pipe, cracked the cement, through the carpet. So the carpet was wet and it was being stuck in between the carpet and the picture. So when we picked up the picture, there was black mold all over the picture and all over the carpet. So you cannot just count on an air sample. Like you have to really get closer to where that, because up there in the air, maybe that's not where they're going to catch it. But then if they would have put it down by where the actual mold was, it probably would have been a lot more effective. So that's why I always tell people, I'm like, just getting an air sample is not okay. You need to be looking behind walls and air vents and all that stuff because it's hides or it's in places we would never have thought it was coming up from our floor, you know?
Yeah. And that's probably one of the harder issues to figure out from the way you had it set up, because you had a bed over the top of it. So even if you're doing like infrared readings and things like that, the bed would block that. That'd be a really hard one to get to. Yep. But the interesting thing is, so let's like talk through that, right? So, because I'm never going to say that I'm going to find every single thing that's happening. Okay? Like, I don't think anyone can say that. Do a really good job of finding stuff, but it's just, it's a house, it's structure. So you do the best that you can. The thing is, though, is that on top of that, the remediation protocols we have, a lot of times we get pushback like, God, this seems way over the top. I don't think I need to do all this stuff. Why are you guys telling me I need to remove all of this and do all of this and do all of that? And part of it is kind of like the scenario you just described. So like in your scenario, here's probably what would have happened. Honestly, probably would not have found that source, I would guess, in the initial inspection, just because it was all covered up. And like, if we're doing infrared scans, the scanner wouldn't have gotten down to that point. So we probably wouldn't have seen that. So let's just say that we missed it. Let's say that we didn't see it. But in addition to figuring out whatever other sources were in the house, we would have done ERMI testing in the house. We would have done mycotoxin testing in the house, different things. And these are dust collections from throughout the house. So we talked a minute ago how all this stuff settles in dust, right? And so we would see in those would have been elevated from what you had going on. So that would have shown up there. And we would have said, okay, we know there's something maybe behind this wall and maybe a couple other places we found in the house. We know that the dust and everything moving through the house, we have elevated mold levels. Maybe we found mycotoxins, maybe we didn't, whatever. And I just said, okay, so in addition to doing the whatever walls, we found maybe needed to be removed, that's the first phase of remediation. This goes back to what you were saying earlier about like, okay, it's in the office, but like, what about everything else, right?
Right.
So the first thing is, sure, anywhere that you find it hidden, you have to remediate it. Maybe you remove a wall or cabinetry. You got to kind of get to that piece and figure it out. The second piece, though, is how has that moved through the house, right? How has it settled on different items in the house? One big thing is carpeting. Whenever we go through a house and we see that there's any sort of elevation in like ERMIs or mycotoxins or bacteria testing or anything like that, all the carpeting comes out because the carpet's going to hold all of it, right? Because we talked about how everything floats around and settles. It's going to get in the carpet. So in that second phase of our cleaning plan, because it's a 2-phase cleaning plan, we would have pulled all the carpet throughout the house, and then you find that, right? So, and there's other things that you pull every appliance out of the house as part of that. So there are things that happen during the remediation process that we write into the scope that may seem like it's beyond need. Like, why are you telling me to do all this stuff? You didn't find something here. Yes, I know that we didn't necessarily find something there, but we know from what's moving around and this and that, that this is something that needs to be done. And then sometimes you find more. And that's why it's so important to think of the whole house as a living system and to not just think that there's one thing in one place and then you're not going to address it everywhere else. So it's actually such a good story that you give, because it really illustrates how even if we didn't find that one thing right there, because it would have been really hard to find, that it still would have been uncovered as part of our overall remediation plan because of how the whole house goes together.
This is why I hate carpet.
Oh, it's the worst.
Say we got rid of all the carpet.
Oh yeah. It's the best thing you can do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, let's talk a little bit about remediation.
Mm-hmm.
So what does a remediation plan look like? And especially for a mold sensitive person, how do you go about that?
Yeah. So, like I was saying, there's kind of 2 phases to it. So the first phase is, so let me set up the analogy so the phases work. Okay. So we talked about how mold is like a factory a little bit earlier, right? So let's imagine you drive by a factory, or, they're making whatever they're making inside. Smoke is coming out of the top of the factory. That's the byproduct coming out. That's what's creating the air pollution technically that we're breathing, right? So the smoke is actually the air pollution that we end up breathing. The air pollution is not what's causing us to breathe it. The factory is what's causing us to breathe it, right? So what we need to do is we have to fix 2 things in that scenario. If our goal in this scenario is to clean the air pollution out of the air, the first thing you have to do is stop the factories from creating the smoke in the first place. You could try to clean the air all day, but if you have factories that keep pumping smoke into the air, you're never going to win. It's just going to keep happening. So the first step is you have to shut the factory down. That's the first phase in this flow. The second phase then is, let's say you bulldoze that factory down, you fired everybody and it's no longer working. Well, all the smoke that came out, it doesn't like magically get sucked back in, right? Like it's out now, right? It got produced, it's out in the air, it's not getting sucked into the chimneys and stuff of the factory when you shut it down. So it's great, we shut the factory down, but all that smoke is still in the air. We have to clean all of that now too, if we're going to really try to get our air quality better outside, right? So there's kind of 2 pieces to it. Same thing in the house. The sources of where the mold growth is, in a wall, in a cabinet, in the basement, in wherever it is, in the HVAC system, wherever's going on, that's the factory, right? That's the factory that's creating the problem. So the first step, phase 1, is actually remediating those areas. And so there's a lot we could do on remediation. I'll try to summarize it. And then if anyone wants more, if you go to remediationmistakes.com, I created like a little mini ebook of the 10 most common remediation mistakes that happen, so you could avoid them from happening. But basically what happens is it's all about source removal. And in each phase, it's all about source removal. So phase 1 is getting rid of the factories. Phase 2 is cleaning up the mess the factories have made up until that point. So those are the 2 phases. So phase 1 is getting rid of the sources, right? And then so you move into phase 2 and you're like, well, what are we getting rid of? If we got rid of all the mold growth already, like what are we getting rid of? So again, it's all about source removal. So what you're getting rid of now are the fragments from the colonies that are floating around, the toxins that have gotten out of the walls and have moved around the house, the spores that are moving around. Basically, like if we're getting sick in the house, it's because we're breathing stuff in the house. That means it got out from behind the walls and it got into the living space, right? So you can't just fix the walls and stuff and then think that everything is fine, because you're still going to be exposed in the house. So then the second piece is basically saying, okay, how do we get rid of all that other stuff? Right? And it's actually a lot harder. It's not as easy as ripping a wall out and getting rid of the source, right? To get rid of these little invisible things that are flying all over the place is difficult. And it's not that we're killing stuff, right? Because spraying some magic spray that's going to like kill everything in the house, one, it doesn't work. And two, let's say it did. Let's say it killed everything. Everything's dead. You know what didn't happen? It didn't remove it all. It just killed it. So imagine like you have a yard and you have this really beautiful yard, and then you have a weed that grows in the yard and you spray it with weed killer. The weed is still there. It's just laying there and it doesn't look as good anymore, right? But the weed is still there. You actually have to pull the weed out of the yard in order for the yard to look great again. And so the thing is, mold doesn't have to be alive to impact us. Like the break off still impacting the house, that mold is technically not alive. That mold is dead. It's dormant. And that can still, we could still breathe that in, and they still trigger the same inflammatory responses in the body, whether it's alive or if it's dead. So this idea that we can just magically spray something in the house and it's going to kill everything and then we're just going to be fine, it just doesn't make any sense when you start to understand how we react to that stuff. And so when we're trying to get that stuff out of the house, you got to think about it. You have all these things floating around. Well, how do I get this stuff out of the house? I can't like grab it, right? There's just too many little things. I have to all get it somewhere so then I can remove it. So this is where a fogging process comes in. A lot of people get sold on these magic fogs that kill everything. The purpose of the fog is not to kill anything in our plan. The purpose of the fog is it basically puts out water droplets everywhere, whatever product you're using. And honestly, I don't even care what product you're using. You could use water. I literally don't care, because the purpose is not to kill anything. The purpose is for these droplets to attach to little invisible particles that are floating around and make them heavy, so gravity will bring them down to the surface. So the fogging is taking everything that's floating around, grabbing all of it, bringing it down to surfaces. So you're like, okay, now I have all of it on surfaces. Now I have to remove it. How do I do that? There's now like a specific wiping process of all the surfaces in the house to get rid of it. This is what the second phase is. So now you remove the sources of in phase one that were creating the problem, this is the actual growth. And then in phase two, we have to remove all the byproducts that were created from those mold factories. And this is the process of getting it all down to surfaces and wiping it all away. And that's how it's all about source removal. It's always about source removal. It's just removing in different ways.
I love that. That's awesome. Really good information. Talk a little bit about how you remediate the HVAC systems. That's
it's hard.
Some people don't even know what an HVAC system is. I mean, would you want to say what that is?
Yeah, so it's either your heating or air conditioning system. So HVAC stands for heating, air conditioning, ventilation. It's like a combo that does heat and AC, basically. Mm-hmm. A lot of people have just heat, and so they'll call it their furnace, and they won't call it an HVAC system. And a lot of times I'll talk to people like, yeah, so how many HVAC systems do you have? They're like, well, we don't have any. I'm like, oh, okay. And then we show up and they have like 2 furnaces that are still forced air with duct runs everywhere. I'm like, okay, so we have ventilation. So the question changed. But it's basically like if you have supply vents in your house that spit out hot or cold air, that is your ventilation system, which can, people sometimes call your HVAC system, but so it's your ventilation system. So here's the deal with those. They can't ever be fully cleaned. They just can't, right? And so first, like, let's talk about how they get impacted. There's 2 ways that a system gets impacted. The first is kind of what we talked about earlier. These systems, they're like, imagine a gigantic, super industrial sized vacuum cleaner suction happening. That's what they're doing. They're sucking air from your house when they turn on. So you have really big vents in your house. Those are called return vents. Those big vents are what the air is getting sucked into your system. It's actually pulling air from your living space. It runs through, all these duct lines, which could be hundreds of feet long, gets to a mechanical unit. And in that mechanical unit, that's where it either gets heated or cooled. And then from that mechanical unit, it sends it out again into all the smaller vents that you have in your house. So usually they're either in the ceiling, high on the wall, or they're in the floor, depending on where you live, are those smaller vents. And those are what the hot or cold air comes out of. So it's like kind of how it's all connected. So when you think of it, you have one mechanical unit, which is usually inside, attic, an interior closet somewhere, or your basement or crawl space is usually where they're housed. Every now and then they're outside. If you can avoid having them outside, that's super ideal. And real quick, just to clarify, the mechanical unit that I'm talking about is where all the ducts attach to. Mm-hmm. That is not the condenser that lives outside of your house. the condenser outside of your house is kind of like the engine for your heating air conditioning system, but your airflow doesn't actually go through there. So it's fine that that's outside, but it's the unit where all your ducts attach to. That's the thing that if you can avoid it, you don't want it outside, because now it's exposed to elements and humidity and all this stuff. And way more often you find mold problems in those than you do in interior ones. So the thing is, if you have issues in the house and the system is pulling all that air through that larger vent, that return vent into the unit, again, we talked about dirt and dust, right? This is where everything collects in a harbor. So the first way that these systems get contaminated is that they just pull a bunch of the dust in the house that happens to be carrying mold and toxins and bacteria and all this stuff. It gets into the system. Most people have flex duct work in their house in some places, in somewhere in their system, but most people have flex because it's way cheaper to put in. Flex duct is like that ductwork that you could kind of squeeze together. And so if you imagine like an accordion, if you're playing an accordion, that trunk line gets squeezed together like that. And there's like little grooves and crevices that get created. If you pull it apart, it's smooth. And then you squish it together and you get all these like little grooves in there. Flex duct running throughout your whole house has grooves just like that everywhere. So now you start thinking about, okay, so the airflow is going through, it's moving some dust particles through, dust is going to wedge in all of those grooves and crevices that are in there, and it's going to stay in there. And then anytime the airflow comes over, it's going to pull little pieces of it as it goes, and it's going to consistently contaminate the house. The thing with that type of ventilation contamination is not that there was mold growing in the system, it's that it became cross-contaminated from all the other stuff that's going on, right? And it's still a problem. So when you open that system and your HVAC technician or your furnace contractor, whoever, you're going to say, hey, I'm worried about my system, I want you to come look at it. They're going to look at it and they're going to say, looks fine to me, right? Because it just looks dirty. That's all that it looks like. But it's what is in the dirt, what is in the dust, what's the composition of that? There can be toxins in that, there can be mold in that, and it can be really like high amounts too. And visibly it looks like nothing, right? So that's why when we test air conditioning systems, we do dust testing inside of the systems, because we're able to do PCR, which is like DNA formatting for mold. We're able to do toxin testing out of that dust and figure out what's happening in there. So that's one way it becomes contaminated. So then you say, okay, let's say it's really a really high mold load in there. It's really contaminated. So what do we do? How do we clean it? Well, think about those duct lines. How can you clean hundreds of feet of duct that you can't reach, that are all squeezed together?
Exactly. Yeah.
Like the ideal way that you would really do it is you'd be able to stretch it all in a perfect world and then wipe all of it on the inside. But unless we have like go-go gadget arms and we're able to stretch all this stuff out, like you can't do that, right? So that's why cleaning, it doesn't work. It can maybe help a little bit, but there's always going to be something left over. And so when we test the systems, if we see anything that looks like significant, it's like, guys, we know that we can't clean this. So let's go back to what the goals were. Why did we start this whole process in the first place? It typically ties back to a health concern. It's like, okay, so if that's the priority goal, we know that this isn't going to ever get fully fixed by us just trying to clean stuff. Then what's your priority, right? And we could try to figure that out. So there are times when replacing the entire system in ductwork is necessary, even when there's no visible mold growth in it, because it's been cross-contaminated so heavily. The second way they become contaminated is there's actually mold growing in the system. This usually happens if there's some sort of mechanical issue in the system, like the water's not draining properly, there's more of a moisture problem in the system. Another reason it could happen is if your system lives like in your basement and you have a bunch of problems in your basement, then all of a sudden it can start growing in the HVAC system. If it lives outside, like I talked about, that's another reason it can happen. And yeah, those are probably, I'm sure. Oh, and maybe another big one. I've seen this in different areas of the country where they put humidifiers attached to their air conditioning system. Don't ever do that. Like you're literally pumping water into your air conditioning system. You're just asking for a massive mold problem. So those are some reasons that would happen. But then when it comes to that, like if you have mold growth in the system, we don't think that cleaning is ever an option. So then you have two options. One is to try to clean it the best you can. And the other is that, there would be replacement that's needed. So,
yeah. We get a lot of questions too in the practice of, gosh, do I have to throw away all my belongings and things like that? Why don't you hit a little bit of that, and then we'll get into a little bit more of the remediation mistakes.
Yeah. You know what's nuts is that's probably the hardest thing for people to wrap their head around is their stuff. It's not even the house, it's their stuff. And it's funny because
it's hard. That's hard.
it is.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's such like a sentimental component to it. Like we're so tied to our stuff for
Uh-huh.
whatever reason, you know? But when you think about like the costs, it's probably more expensive to fix the house than the stuff, than to replace the stuff. Yet for some reason, we're so hung up on this one chair that I have to keep, you know? And so then again, I go back. I always start all the conversations with people before we even fly out to go to them. Like we do like a pre, you know, kind of conversation with them. It's like, what are you guys' goals? What are you hoping to get out of us coming out here? What do you want me to find ideally? What would you want to do with that information? And what is your plan like after that, right? Like, what do you want to do? So we kind of get an understanding of where their head is at. But then I also like refer back to that when I'm talking to them, because sometimes people just need to be pulled out of the like overwhelm of the immediate thing they're looking at and take a step back and realize like why we started doing this in the first place, you know? And so when you're talking about stuff, there are certain things that can't be cleaned. They just can't. Anything that's cushioned can't be cleaned. Mattresses, couch cushions, down comforters, pillows. And the reason is that the particles that all float around, remember we keep talking about these little particles that are floating all over the place and settle on your stuff. They're going to settle on a mattress, and then you're going to sit on your mattress, and the pores of the mattress are going to open, and they're going to get into the cushions, and there's no way to ever get it out, right? And so then every time that you sit down on it, it's going to kind of pop up a little bit, and you're always going to keep getting re-exposed. Because the best you could try to do is surface clean it in some way, but you're not getting into the cushion, right? So anything that's cushioned it just can't be cleaned. Beyond that, I actually think a lot of stuff can be cleaned. It really, there's things you have to start considering when you're doing it. So a couple of years ago, I did the first training course that I did, which was called Mold Masterclass. And there was a section in it about your stuff and like content cleaning. And there's this matrix that I made. It was called the Content Salvation Matrix. And basically it was an idea of a way to kind of like look at all of your stuff and categorize them in certain ways and then decide if it's worth trying to clean it or not, basically. And so if you imagine like a chart, like an x-axis and a y-axis, right? Like on the vertical axis is the type of item that it is. So you have three types. You have porous, which is like fabrics and things like that. You have semi-porous, like woods, things like that are semi-porous. And then you have solids, which are like glass and metal and like dishes and ceramics and stuff like that, right? So you have those three. It's the ease of cleaning gets easier as the item gets more solid. It's kind of the general rule, right? So you kind of have that. On the bottom side of the axis, you have the value of the item. Cheap, expensive, sentimental value, you can't replace it if anything happened, right? And then you put them on this chart and you start plotting out like, okay, so this is, this little knickknack that I got that, yeah, it's solid, but it's super cheap and doesn't mean anything to me and it fits here. Like, do I really
toss it out? Yeah.
Maybe I should just toss this thing. Like, yes, I could technically clean it, I guess, but like, maybe I should just get rid of this thing. This doesn't matter, right? Versus like I have this really expensive armoire or something and it's in the middle range and it's really expensive, or it's in the sentimental value category. It's like, okay, so it's worth trying to clean. We have to understand that there are certain things that just won't ever clean fully, but it's worth trying. And then I introduce in there a way to, or I put in there a way to reintroduce things back into your house. So the thing is like we go through the house, right? You remediate the whole house. You come back in, you do post testing and post inspections to make sure the remediation worked. So all the mold is gone and like the toxins are gone. And you go through all this stuff, and there's testing on the front end, there's testing on the back end to make sure. With your stuff, you're not really testing everything individually because it just gets outrageously expensive to do that. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. So the testing we do in the house initially gives us an idea of what's settling on everything. So it's like a representative sample. This is kind of what's on everything. When you come back in the house, you're usually not retesting stuff before you bring it in the house, right? Because again, it'd be a lot of retesting on things. So we just assume that the cleaning worked, whereas in the house, you don't just assume that. You're like, there's no way I'm assuming this. I need to test to make sure that it worked, right? So it's like, okay, there's this disconnect here. How do I try to figure this out on my items? So it's this idea of like reintroducing things slowly back into the house, right? I know people are like out of their house sometimes for a couple months and all they want to do is get back in and they just want to move all their stuff back in and be in there. But if if you have things like, wood dressers and armoires and things like that, they're semi-porous, meaning there is some pores in there. Like, again, all we can do is surface clean. You can't get into the pores of stuff, right? A lot of times it's enough for wood. Sometimes it just isn't for whatever reason. And if we bring everything we own back in the house at once and we start reacting again, we're not going to have any idea what triggered our reaction. We're going to think that we have to throw everything we own out. And this really not necessarily true. Like, I was working with a client who's actually a doctor, and she, a lot of doctors have their own story, and that's how they get into this. And so we did her house, and she had issues, and so we were kind of going through this, and she was bringing stuff back in, and she had this antique like armoire that was like passed down through her family through generations, like really old. And she was bringing stuff in slowly. As soon as she brought that thing in her room, she just triggered again. Mm-hmm. She's like, okay, I can't have this here, right? And so she took it back out. If she brought everything in the house at the same time,
you would have never known.
Right.
Yeah. So if we can fight the urge a little bit to just get everything in as fast as we can, because I know we're frustrated and it's annoying and we're so close to the end and we just want to sleep in our own bed and kind of be in our own place. But like, if we can move things in maybe room by room or like kind of settle stuff in a slower pattern, then we can get a better feel for how effective cleaning actually has been on stuff. And that can be helpful in that.
What about clothes?
Yeah, so clothes is a big one. So I had this very wealthy client a while ago, and they have all of these expensive clothes. And so they asked the same question. I was like, listen, guys, same thing I just said. I was like, we didn't test them specifically. I don't know exactly what's happening with the individual items, this blah, blah, we were talking about it. He's like, well, let's test them. And I was like, cool, let's test them. And it gave me like a little mini case study that I could use, right? So we took a sampling of kind of 2 sets of clothing, and we did mold testing. So basically what ERMI testing is, but we did it in a different way. So you're still using the PCR analysis method that ERMI uses, but you're not getting a score basically because it's not really collected the right way. But we're able to see like the mold load and what types are there and kind of all the same molds that are on that panel. So we did that, and then we also did mycotoxin testing on the clothes. And so we did that for 2 sets of clothes. Both sets had mycotoxins in them, and both had a higher load of mold than you probably would want to see, right? So that's what we
probably did. Because they're porous, right? I mean, clothes would
and because the house
really hold on to mold.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that here, when it comes to clothes, if it's growing on the clothes, get rid of it. Like you're visibly seeing.
What if you can't see it, but let's say you had clothes in a house that was very infested in mold. I mean, a house that you walk in and you smell the mold, like that's how bad the mold is, right? And you wash them, like really thoroughly wash them. Is that going to take care of it, or do you need to get rid of them?
I think it has an opportunity to, and that's kind of what happened with this like little case study that I had from this wealthy client, right? So we did 2 things. One, we washed their clothing in washing machine. Their doctor recommended using ammonia and water as the detergent instead of regular detergent. So that's what they did. And then the other set of clothes were like more like suits and stuff and like kind of nicer clothes. So we took those to a dry cleaner and they dry cleaned them. Once they cleaned them, they sealed them all up in bags for me and like airtight sealed them until I was able to get back to the house, and then I opened them and I tested all of them again. And mycotoxins were gone in both of them. Mold loads were like way lower, right? Like more consistent with what might just be normal from being alive, basically. And so the thought process after I saw this, I was like, okay, so like what's going on? What happened here? We know things are porous, stuff gets into it. We know that you can't get into cushions because you can't get into it. But when you're washing clothing, you're kind of like power washing through all the fibers. Like you can actually get into all the fibers that way, right? And what's happening in a cross-contamination situation like you just described is there's problems in the house, right? But it's not physically growing on the clothing, right? So it's just the byproduct that's settling everywhere. It just gets into the fibers. So what I think happened is that they basically were able to clean all the particle out through the cleaning processes, and it worked, right? So I don't have like a massive study to like lean on or anything, but I saw this happen on 2 different types of cleaning. One was a washing machine, one was a dry clean, and they both ended up being okay. So again, I think it's worth attempting to clean stuff. If you have jackets that are like, down, or there's things in there that you can't, that's different, right? If you can't put it in a washing machine, that's different. But other things, I think that it's worth trying.
Okay, good.
So, what are some of the common remediation mistakes?
So I wish I could pull my thing up real quick. So I made a list of 10 of them and I put it into this little ebook, but I'll do a couple of them right now.
Can you give us a link so that we can put that in the show notes?
Yes, we can do that. It's easy. It's remediationmistakes.com, but
Perfect.
I'll send it to you guys too. So it's easy for anyone listening. And it's a free download. Literally just put your email in there and then I'll send it to you. So it's like
Awesome.
So these are just the 10 things I thought off the top of my head as I was putting this together. I'm like, so many of these things can happen. I'm gonna make this list and I'm just gonna do this. So a couple of them. One is not removing enough building material. I don't know what it is. Remediators come in and it's like they want to save, they're more focused on the money piece, which I get to some extent. They're more focused on the money piece and they're more focused on like what it's going to take to rebuild something than they are on actually remediating, right? And it's a big mistake. And I feel like homeowners almost want them to be like that because they don't want to spend more than they have to and they want it to be easier to rebuild. But at the end of the day, like you're hiring someone to remediate a mold problem. You're not hiring someone to make your rebuild easier.
Right.
And so like when I go through like sampling plans and things like that, it could be expensive, you know? And when I talk about remediation, I put in remediation plans what I think best case scenario is going to be to make it happen. I don't consider finances. I don't consider how long you have to be out of the house. It's not my job to do that. My job is to tell you how to get it done. And then if you come to me and say, listen, I can only afford X, or like we need this and this, then we can talk through it, right? And maybe come up with like an alternative or priority list or something like that. But if you never got the real list, the real plan in the first place, it's like I'm taking that decision out of your hands, and it's not my job to do that, you know? And I feel like remediators do that a lot. They come in, they're like, oh, you only need to cut up this far. Like, guys, first off, the industry just standard guidebook says you have to remove 2 feet beyond any sort of visible water staining, any sort of, you know, discoloration, anything like that. So at the very least, if you're just following the industry guide that everyone should be following, this isn't for like hypersensitive people. It's literally just like, if I'm a remediator, this is what I'm supposed to do. Then you need to be doing that at least. And there's so many times that I come in and they're like, oh, the issue, I keep looking, so I'm looking at a window, like an example in my head. Like, oh, there was this issue under this window. So I'm just gonna cut out the wall under the window because it came from the window. And then I go back and look, and on the framing piece that's exposed, right next to where they cut the drywall, so there's more drywall, there's mold on that framing piece. Like, guys, you had to cut further. You had to go at least 2 feet farther than that. Like, you botched this. You made a mistake.
What's the point?
Right.
Yeah, what's the point?
What's the point if you're not going to do it right?
I know, and it's just super frustrating. And I think part of it, so the remediation game, even the inspection game, really, when you're talking more like general public and like the ServPros of the world and going on Yelp and finding an inspector and all that stuff, it's really competitive and it's all about price. People are just price focused on it. They're price shopping.
It's because they're not educated a lot, you know?
Yeah. And they underbid just so they can get the job, because their job is volume. Their job is we need as many projects as we can get done. And so if we have to underbid on this to get in, then that's what we do. When you get into the realm of people that we work with, it's different. Like, all of those people are not competitors, you know? We're talking with people that understand like what's happening with health, and they understand like, okay, if I need to get this fixed, we need to do this the right way. Let's talk through this. So it gets a little different. But yeah, so that's one big mistake. Another big mistake I see is, I know this sounds like so stupid kind of, but like, they don't actually remove the mold from the surfaces. It is so ridiculous to me. So like, you go in, you contract a remediator. The remediator's job is to remove mold from your house. That's their job, right? You're like, oh, I had this thing in this wall. I need you to remove the mold that has been created. And they go in and just remove the drywall, and they don't actually remove the growth from the studs behind the drywall, and they don't clean the area of all the drywall debris and the construction debris, because all of that, just like dirt and dust, will carry the byproducts around, right? And so they don't really remediate. They kind of like surface pull stuff off, And then they say that everything's good. And then I come back in and there's literally mold all over the framing, but they did an air sample 5 feet away and it was fine. So that means that everything was clean, right? And then I come in and I do a surface test on the framing, which is what their job was actually to do. And there's a humongous mold count that's still there, right? And so that's another big mistake that happens. Like, you have to make sure they're actually removing the mold from the structural surfaces that remain, right? It's fine to remove the drywall, that's cool, but the framing and the studs and all those pieces, like if mold is still growing in that stuff and then you put new drywall over it, well, there you go. You still got mold behind the wall, it's still gonna come out and get you. So those are a couple things. If you wanted the rest of them, the guide has the other ones.
Download that guy. What's this website again, Brian?
It's remediationmistakes.com.
That's easy, guys. Just type it in, download it. You got it right there. Come on, you can do it. All right. So the last thing I want to ask you is, how do you know if a remediation was successful?
Yes. So we were just kind of talking about it. Okay. So let's just go on the scenario I was talking about. We had this issue. They pulled out drywall. They didn't really clean it that well. What most post remediation testing looks like is you do an air sample and a containment. That's all they do. No freaking clue why this became the standard, but this is what people do. They come in, they take an air test in the middle of a containment. Let's think about what a containment is. A controlled environment, literally with an air scrubbing cleaning machine running while you're in a sealed up box. The air better freaking be clean in that room, right? Yes. Like if the air's not clean, holy crap, there's like a massive problem going on in here.
Yeah.
And so, but they come in and they take these air samples in containment while the air scrubbers are running and they come back clear and like, okay, everything's good. But why were they there in the first place? Like, mold wasn't growing in the air. Mold was growing on the surfaces.
Yeah.
You have to test the surfaces to know if the mold is gone. You have to do surface testing on that stuff. Yes, it's important to do the air testing in containments because they're doing a lot of demo, right? They're disturbing a bunch of stuff. You're creating these little explosions everywhere. So it's really important to do that. But the air scrubber should be doing its job, hopefully, and it should be cleaning that up. So you do need to validate it 100%. You have to do that, but that can't be the only sample you take in a space. You actually have to go and do surface testing. So if I'm in a room and they took 2 walls out completely from floor to ceiling, then I'm doing a surface sample where I'm going over all the framing that's exposed that was behind those 2 walls, and I'm collecting it all. I'm usually just doing it on one sample. You don't test every stud separately. You just have to do a composite collection, make sure there's no mold left. If I do that surface test, and I can't tell you how many times when you do a post, the air sample looks totally fine, and the surface tests show that there are still problems.
Wow.
And then we say, okay, you failed, right? Your job was to clean the mold off stuff. You didn't do it. You have to go back in and re-clean all this stuff. And they go back in and re-clean it, and then we retest again. We retest the surfaces again and make sure that it cleared. So that is how you know that phase 1 worked, right? So we talked about the 2 phases, right? So phase 1 is when you're removing stuff and kind of getting the growth structures out. So you might have a house where there's 10 containments that are set up. There's a bathroom upstairs, a bathroom downstairs, a laundry room, the kitchen. There might be a number of things going on. You have to go to each one of those containments. You have to do an air test in them at minimal. And then you also have to do at least 1 surface test of all the exposed remediated surfaces in there. So any of the exposed framing or whatever might be left over. So that's the first piece. Once all that stuff clears, and the next piece was, remember all the stuff that's moving through the house, the mess that all the mold made originally, right? And so what's floating in the air? How do we know that we got rid of that stuff? So that's more, it's more progressive testing at that point, because you're not testing for growth, you're testing for smaller particles and byproducts and things like that. So we go back into the house, we do ERMI testing, mycotoxin testing. If we ended up doing bacteria testing at the front end, we'll mimic that on the back end so we understand that everything's clear. But you do that throughout the whole house, including the remediated areas and the non-remediated areas. You do it through the whole house. At that point, I usually like to split the house in sections, because if it fails and you're doing like an entire floor or an entire 3,000 square foot house, you don't really know like exactly where it failed. And so you'd be telling the remediators to go back in and re-clean an entire house. Well, maybe they didn't have to. So I usually like to split out the attic separately, because that sometimes has more problems. Mm-hmm. I'll typically do like an upstairs and downstairs the same if it's like a normal sized house. But then if they have like a basement or a crawl, I would probably do that separately too, because they have more significant issues there. And we look at those 3 levels. If the main living space of the house looks good, we're like, cool, but the attic still isn't great, then you have to go back up and re-clean the whole attic. And then we go back and we would do it again. So testing, it's also visual inspection. So, which is actually the first thing we do, but you basically go in. So like if I write a remediation plan that says remove this whole wall, and I come in and they removed half the wall, like, what the hell are you guys doing? Fail right now. Why is this wall still here? It'd be the same as like you guys had a client and you're like, listen guys, or a patient, you're like, listen guys, if you do these 3 things, you're going to be healthy. If you work out and you take these supplements and you sleep this much, you're going to be healthy. Okay. Do this for a month, come back and see me and tell me what's going on. And then they come back in a month and you're like, all right, guys, how you feeling? And they're like, I'm still not super great. You're like, okay, so what have you been doing? Like, well, I've been exercising and I've been sleeping. And you're like, okay, what about the supplements? You're like, I don't like them. Okay,
I've
what do you
never ever heard that before, Brian. I don't know who would do that.
Who would do that? And then I'm sure in your mind, you're like, what the hell? Of course you're not getting better. You can't say that to them, right? But it's like
a piece of the puzzle. This is what I say. I'm like, you got to get the whole puzzle. You can't get a piece of the puzzle. You got to get the whole puzzle. That's why with mold, it's like, why take one part of it when it's all over?
Right.
You can't. It doesn't. No.
Yeah. The big thing that I always say at the end of like this topic is like, you're working with your doctor for a reason, right? You've probably researched, you've probably been to a bunch of doctors already by the time you found somebody that gets it, right? And you're working with them for a reason. Do what they tell you to do, right? Like this is why you're working with them, And then the same is with us. Like we're not cheap. Like, I'm not gonna lie, right? Like we're flying out, we're doing all this stuff. I mean, it's not like a local guy's coming out for $500, right? Like there's an investment to get us out there to do this. If you're going to do that, and then you want me to tell you how to fix everything, and then you don't do what I tell you to do, then why did you even bring me out in the first place? Like, what's the point, right? Mm-hmm. And so when I go into a space and I'm doing like the visual after remediation and I look, and this isn't usually on the clients, a lot of times the remediators are screwing this up. So this isn't to like blow back on them, but it's like, I told you to open this whole wall and you open up half the wall, and I walk in the room like, well, this is wrong. All right, so we need to come back and do some more here. Half the time the clients don't even know. You come back, you show them the pictures, and they're like, oh, well, I mean, I just told them to do what you told them to do, right? So I would say, like, if you're the client, you got to be more involved. You can't trust people to get things done the way.
I love that. That's good.
Yeah, you kind of got to be the quarterback of what's going on, right? Mm-hmm. If you're the quarterback on the football team, you've got your coaches on the side that are feeding you the plays. And it's like, okay, so I got to run this play and I got to do this. Cool. So I know what plays I have to do. But at the end of the day, you're communicating with your receivers and you're the one snapping the ball and throwing it to them, right? You can't just expect the receiver to know what the play is, because the play gets called into the quarterback. It doesn't get called to the receiver, And then if the receiver doesn't know what, like if they make a mistake, you have to let them know, like, no, guys, this is the way you do it. The quarterback runs the whole field team. You need to be that person, right? You need to be that quarterback.
And that goes for our patients, right, Beck? Yeah. Like the most involved, the most questions they ask, they get better. They really do. The ones that are really involved.
We always know who really put in the effort, and they're always like, thank you so much. I'm like, thank yourself. You did it. I mean,
you did it.
I don't know what to do, but you actually did it. You can't be 1 foot in when it comes to your health. And, we work with a lot of patients with mast cell activation syndrome and histamine intolerance, and mold is one of the biggest triggers of those issues. So if you're going to, and this is what I say to people, I'm like, don't let anyone come out and just take an air sample. I'm like, find someone who is going to dig and really find out. And I actually recently had a patient, she was, I always am like, I think you have mold. I mean, I say this all the time to people because it's just like, they're not getting better by fixing their gut and changing their diet. I'm like, I think you have mold. And then this girl, she said, this is awesome, really awesome story. She had someone, she's like, no, I had someone come out. I said, well, what did they do? She goes, I just took an air sample in my room. And I was like, I said, no, you need to find someone who's really thorough. And I always lead people to your Instagram. And I said, they need to be looking behind the walls and your air ducts. Like they need to be, and I don't know the exact procedure because it's not my specialty, but like you need someone who's really digging in. So she got another person to come out. They found a ton of mold behind her walls in numerous rooms, all in her air ducts. And then we did a mycotoxins test on her body, and we saw all the different types of mold she actually had in her body. And so she remediated it. I think she actually moved out. And then we worked with, her body to get it out of her body. And she's like, she just emailed us and she goes, I want to let you guys know that I'm pregnant. She's like, I've been trying for 3 years to get pregnant. I did IVF, which failed. I've done this, I've done that. And now I'm pregnant. And it was like right after I got my body clean from this mold, I got pregnant. I mean, it's crazy. And I'm like,
we hear those things all the time. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. The best part is the follow-ups from people
that
have done it. I've had people send me like Christmas cards. They even, I had someone send my wife also a Christmas card. They never met her. And the Christmas card was basically thanking her for supporting me to do what I do to allow me to help the client.
I love that.
It was insane. It's really, really cool.
Well, because there's you can't put a price tag on health. You can't. Mm-hmm. And that's why when you're doing something like this, if you're going to decide to get healthy, whether it's looking for mold and remediating it properly, or working with, functional medicine doctor, whatever it is, like all of it, you cannot be 1 foot in. You have to do it the right way, and you have to do it fully, and then you will get better. And that's the difference. So, and that's why I wanted to have you on, because I think people are so misled in the mold world about what a proper inspection looks like and what a proper remediation looks like. And, Krystal and I will do a follow-up to this on what to do about it, in your body. But, I'm so glad that you came on and talked to us about this, because this is stuff that people don't know, because they're just listening to the person who's coming out and doing the inspection, and they're just taking their word for it. So it's definitely something that needs a lot more attention, because mold is no joke. I'm telling you, I almost wished I was dead when I was living in mold. I felt the worst I've ever felt in my life. And then once I got out of it, my life came back. So it's a huge deal, So thank you so much for coming on and sharing all your knowledge about this.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I love talking about this stuff.
I know. So where can people find you? I know we're going to put your worksheet in.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple places. There's so my inspection company is called We Inspect. So this is my company. We travel around, fly to people.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was crazy, because a few years ago, we were getting so many inquiries from everywhere, but we were still local. Like, how do we figure out how we can help more people? Like, how do we help more people? So we created this entire infrastructure to support us flying all over the place. So we train people specifically that we train that fly. And then most of the inspections I oversee personally myself from home. Or from the office, home right now, but from the office. And then if it's not me, then it's my partner and co-founder, Corey. So one of the two of us are overseeing it from home base. So you have somebody on site who we train personally, and then we are also going with them through the house, kind of like, through video and stuff. So that's called We Inspect. The website is yesweinspect.com. We're working out a kind of like an application form right now that we're going to be rolling out pretty soon to see if you might be a good fit for us. So that's going to be coming out. I also do a webinar. I actually have stopped doing it live, and we're automating it, because so many people that couldn't make the one time I did it every 2 weeks, and then they were frustrated they couldn't get it. So I ended up recording it, and now people can just get it on demand whenever they want to watch it. We're going to roll that out in like the next week or so. We're just making some tweaks to it, but that's it's called Mold Finders Method. And so it's moldfindersmethod.com. I kind of talked through in more detail, a lot of what we talked about today. So like the issues that local inspectors have and why it's not working, and some of that stuff, and remediation, and also like the big thing about it is how you can find like hidden mold in your house yourself. And that's really what the big piece of it is called, how to find the hidden mold in your home that's making you sick, and actually talk through like, this is how you do it. You look for these things. And if people are into it, there's a program that they can get, and they can go through their own homes and figure out where all the problems are without hiring a local inspector that, as we talked about, is probably not going to do a good job anyway. So there's that. And then I have a podcast too, Mold Finders Radio. So I talk forever on that podcast. So if there's ever anything you're interested in, you could
Love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. This was awesome.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. This is really cool. I'm glad that we got to do it.
So nice meeting you.
And thanks everyone for listening. And if you guys like this episode, please leave a review. reviews really help us because it helps other people find our podcast. And if you may not have mold yourself, but you may suspect someone you love has mold, send them the podcast so they can kind of learn and they can get to Brian's resources that he has, because he has so many. So thank you guys for listening, and I hope everyone has a great day. And thanks again, Brian, for coming on.
Yeah, thank you guys. Have a good one, everyone.
You too. Bye.